I think those are some of the lessons that Taiwan can learn. Places like Norway, for example, are very good at defense innovation. Sweden, despite being very small, is very good at defense innovation as well through state companies like Saab, not just the cars, but also they produce Gripen jets and other sort of things. So I do think Taiwan has this opportunity to really learn from countries that are smaller and are a little bit more nimble to try to be able to sort of reinvent itself internally as well.
You're watching Connected Sidelines, coming to you from the heart of Taipei, a show in which we dive deep into the issues that connect us all in Taiwan and around the world. And speaking of around the world, there are few issues more global than security. Against the backdrop of ongoing conflicts in Europe and the Middle East and US-China economic and military rivalry, Taiwan sits in a precarious geopolitical position and faces the increasing need to bolster its defenses. However, the current administration is facing considerable pushback on their plans to boost defense spending. So, can the country, often hailed as Technology Island, upgrade its defense tech well enough to deter aggression? To discuss this challenge, we have in the studio Bryce Barros, Taiwan's INDSR visiting fellow and an associate fellow at the think tank GLOBSEC. Thank you for coming into the studio.
Thank you, Tomasz.
I want to start with something that really reverberated around Taiwan when it first happened. In 2024, Admiral Sam Paparo, who was at the time the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, highlighted the need to, and I quote, turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities so I can make the Chinese military's lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me the time for the rest of everything. So this term, unmanned hellscape, has really stuck around. And many people kind of say that when they talk about drones. What does that mean exactly? Or what should it mean? How should we read this term, unmanned hellscape?
Sure. Happy to answer. And thank you so much, Tomasz, for letting me participate today. So I think what the Admiral was referring to was a outgrowth of a project that the Department of Defense was working on called the Replicator Initiative. So back in 2023, under the Biden administration, the then Deputy Secretary of Defense, Catherine Hicks, announced the Replicator Initiative, which goal was to do exactly what Admiral Paparo said, which is to develop low-cost, attritable defense tech munitions and other sort of technologies to be able to sort of keep China at bay anywhere along the first island chain or beyond. And you could really find the DNA in what the Admiral was saying within that strategy unto itself, right? And the goal was to meet that goal by 2025 and have thousands of drones that could be manned by U.S. Pacific Command by that time. Unfortunately, the Pentagon has not. However, most recently, there was a report from a think tank in the United States called the Center for a New American Security, called Hellscape for Taiwan, which actually just published a report recently about this topic where they lay out the different sort of drones or technologies that could be used by Taiwan to help defend the island in several different layers, going from an outer layer of about 40 to 80 kilometers off the island to a middle layer of about 40 to 5 kilometers off the island to the running up to the shore, which is about 5 kilometers away, and then the actual beach itself. So what are the weapons that Taiwan itself needs to be able to produce that sort of hellscape? Obviously separate from the Admiral's comments, which was referring to U.S. Pacific Command, not to Taiwan itself. But right now, you can see that the Taiwan government has been working to be able to develop those capabilities and field them to protect the island and deter a potential military contingent or any invasion contingency by People's Liberation Army or any sort of entity on the other side of the Taiwan Strait.
Well, speaking of the other side of the Taiwan Strait, the PRC is a veritable powerhouse when it comes to drone production, and they have been upgrading their military tech very vigorously over the last few years. Can Taiwan realistically out-hellscape China in terms of producing unmanned systems and fielding them in a possible conflict?
So there's a few different ways to think about out hellscaping, and I use that in quotation marks. I'll do it with the air quotation marks in my hand. China in that sort of case, right? You're also thinking about how many different systems can fit realistically within the Taiwan Strait, either in the water or the air. So you had like similar sort of issues, for example, during the Cold War, when you would talk about the invasion of Western Germany, right, through the Fulda Gap, right? Even though there's a long line going through a divided Germany at the time, there was only so many different ways that different military units could go through due to mountains or other sort of terrain. Not that that's necessarily the case with the Taiwan Strait. Obviously, it's a wide body of water. However, what's notable about that is it also makes it difficult to try to pack so many systems in there without having sort of a friendly fire sort of an issue. So that's or friendly fire issue. So that's the first sort of aspect of that. It is more expensive to make drones or make defense tech here, especially that doesn't use Chinese parts, right? Most notably, batteries are a big problem. Taiwan's really trying to develop that sector. Other like-minded countries like South Korea are really advanced, arguably the most advanced when it comes to non-PRC provided batteries. But once you sort of table that stuff aside, where the sort of hellscape that China's sort of looking to and what Taiwan can do is really focusing on anything that would keep away large platforms that could carry over troops, supplies. So that could be a mixture of military and civilian vessels, which the Chinese Navy, or rather the PLA Navy, has shown their desire to want to use in the future, in addition to a mix of civilian aircraft and military aircraft that would be used to ferry over troops if there ever was any kind of a beachhead or forward operating base that was established on the island. So that's really the key of having this Hellscape strategy, is to prevent that as much as possible, but also initially to keep the fight away from Taiwan as much as possible on the other side of the median line of the Taiwan Strait.
Well, a lot of people, I'm sure, when they hear, drones possibly used in the Taiwan Strait, they think, kind of DJI for propellers, that kind of like small system. But it would, at least to me, make sense to kind of think about unmanned surface vessels.
Yes.
Specifically in this scenario. What is the balance of power sort of in that aspect between China and Taiwan currently?
Right now, Taiwan is catching up to China on that regard, but I don't necessarily think that that means that it's a lost cause for Taiwan. So Taiwan has tried to, through the Navy and other parts of government, do several exercises and experimentations to see what does it look like for uncrewed or unmanned surface vessels. Also, to that point, uncrewed or unmanned underwater vessels too,
right? Yes,
to be able to sort of keep Chinese forces at bay. And I think the key that Taiwan's going to really need going forward in order to make sure that Taiwan stays safe is to really put more of an emphasis on those platforms. It's also important to remember that these platforms don't exist in a perfect world. For many of us who happen to have spent a lot of time in Taiwan, and I know you spent years here, how safe do you feel going swimming out in the waters around this island?
Well, they do have a degree of danger, yes. It's
exactly,
not exactly the most welcoming coast.
Exactly. And tragically, there's stories of people who end up losing their lives because they swam too far away. That's just a small example of how choppy the waters can be. And then you think about that related to typhoons, which are only increasing due to accelerations of climate change. So none of this is happening in an isolated sort of box where Taiwan or China are able to use these weapons in perfect conditions. In certain times of the year are more prone to more weather events that would make it more difficult to field a USV or a UUV or a medium or long range uncrewed or unmanned aerial vehicle as well to help keep the PLA away from Taiwan. So it's a double-edged sword. It makes it difficult for Taiwan to deploy some of these systems depending on the weather system and the current. But conversely, that's also a very big danger to China as well, as they try to invade or do some kind of punitive action against the island.
Well, we are now in the 5th year of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I'm not going to ask you about, what lessons should we learn from the conflict in Ukraine, because, everyone in their refrigerator has discussed the lessons that should be learned. How is Taiwan actually absorbing and applying these lessons almost over 4 years after? Is there a measurable impact on the doctrine here, on the development of technology?
Yeah, you can see a lot of different movement from within the Taiwan government, specifically the Ministry of National Defense, towards wanting to learn lessons from what's happening with Ukraine in a few different ways. One way that could be coming up, or rather is manifesting, right, is the push to want to acquire more drones in general. So they're talking about like FP drones. And if you look at the special defense budget, which I'm sure will come up later, you can look at the number of drones that puts an emphasis on, right? Another aspect of where this is coming on is where the military is changing. So Taiwan has announced its Defense Innovation Office, which is supposed to look at trying to acquire defense technologies for the Ministry of National Defense. Now there's a UAV park in Jiayi. There's a military command that's looking at training related to drones and what have you. So those are some of the like more sort of structural organizational lessons that you're seeing. So the desire to want to get and acquire more drones is a big aspect of that. There's also a few other things that kind of aren't as publicly mentioned, but have come up. So for example, last October, Liberty Times reported that Jiayi Air Base, or rather the Taiwan Air Force, requested netting that they could use at Jiayi Air Base to help protect the air base itself. Some of that is coming from lessons related to understanding that netting could actually be a really key thing to protecting critical infrastructure from things like FPV drones or smaller sort of drones, right? But I think that part of the Ukraine lesson, in addition to some of the things that you're seeing right now related to the current war involving Iran, is really showing how important counter systems to UAVs or UAS systems really are. And if there's anything that Taiwan should be really learning from Ukraine, that you're starting to see more inkling or more sort of percolation towards, especially with the announcement of the T-Dome concept last year by President Lai, is really emphasizing counter measures and counter systems to drones, UAS, UAV, so that different facilities could be maintained as being safe as well. And also, what does that mean for like big military platforms like Cloud Leopard armored personnel carriers or Abrams tanks, which Taiwan has recently started to acquire? What does that mean, lessons learned for Taiwan's military, which uses Apaches and Cobras, and how significant those platforms have been in Ukraine for trying to take down Shahed drones, right? As we're seeing, tragically, the cost of not taking those threats seriously in case of what's happening in Iran, and some American personnel and other individuals who have died from the deadliness of those drones being so low and slow. So I think those are the lessons that Taiwan really needs to put an emphasis on. And it's getting there. T-Dome is a nice first step, but I'm really keen to see what does the government do next? Where do politicians sort of take this? And what are some of the lessons that Ministry of National Defense wants to learn from that?
You mentioned T-Dome, but in light of what's going on in Iran right now and just in the Middle East, for a layperson like myself, some of the footage that has come out of that conflict is casting a bit of doubt on the effectiveness of the future T-Dome system, which is going to be based at least partially on Patriot missiles, if I'm not mistaken. Now, there was a famous clip where I think 3 or 4 Patriot missiles failed to intercept one Iranian missile. Is that giving you any kind of second thoughts about the efficacy of the T-Dome project?
It depends on the threat, right? So it's important to remember that the more tragic threats that have been able to kill and maim civilians and allied military personnel have really come from slower and low-moving drones like Shahed. That does not take away from missiles and other sort of platforms, which Patriot and other sort of higher-level air defense systems are designed to take out. I think the bigger key for Taiwan is going to be making sure that some of those smaller drones and drones that are much easier to get under radar are able to be handled or taken care of. And I'm not 100% sure, to the point of the criticism that you've heard about T-Dome, that there's been enough evidence, or rather emphasis, in the years before the announcement on wanting to make sure that those threats are taken care of. Because Taiwan does have the capability to take out large missiles and other sort of things, right? I mean, that's all stuff that's publicly known and what have you. And T-Dome even alludes to that in some of the concepts that you can see about it. But what about smaller sort of drones that you can really use to kind of get under radar systems and could be used to take out a very key military facility or something like an LNG terminal or other sort of like key nodes of critical infrastructure that this island depends on?
Well, okay, so let's get back to drones. Yeah, low and slow, drone versus drone. What do you see as the biggest challenge facing the Taiwanese drone industry, specifically in light of national security?
I think it's a few different things. I think the most challenging things are several. So first of all, I think Taiwan's going to need to move faster. One thing that we've noticed, especially coming from places like Central and Eastern Europe, Ukraine, is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are able to be so effective is a desire to sort of see something that doesn't work, move on quickly and try something else. I think another challenge is going to be is making sure that you're getting rid of as much of the stovepiping across the Taiwan government and industry towards drones, right? So drones aren't just a Ministry of National Defense issue. They're an issue for the Ministry of Economic Affairs, the National Science and Technology Council, formerly known as the Ministry of Science and Technology, ITRI, and some of these other government offices, Ministries of Digital Affairs, where there's an emphasis on saying that you need to work with civilians in government and civilians in private industry to be able to get the drone industry to where it is. So I think that that's going to be the next big challenge. And I think many in Taiwan are thinking towards that. But I'm really keen to see where this goes in the coming years, because that is going to be the key, not only to secure Taiwan's defense overall, but also could make drones in the next big boom industry here to power Taiwan's economic growth.
Well, that is happening already to an extent. I know that Taiwan signed an MOU with a Polish Chamber of Unmanned Systems that follows a boom in drone sales to Poland.
Yeah.
Apparently, Poland now buys, according to Bloomberg, 60% of Taiwan's drone exports, which have shot up by 750% in 2025. What do those numbers tell you? I mean, are we really seeing that big of an improvement in production capacity, or is it just that Taiwan is selling more of those drones?
To take a step back to answer that too, it's also worth affirming that Prime Minister Donald Tusk even recently highlighted the importance of technology cooperation with Taiwan, which you can only put in the lines for what that may or may not allude to. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with systems that likely are probably going to Ukraine or other parts of the region. Poland is a place that feels very vulnerable, understands what it's like to be under these sort of threats, and is really emphasizing its own sort of military buildup domestically, not only just working with the drone industry, for example, in Taiwan, but buying systems from South Korea, for example, and higher level sort of platforms. So I think it does speak to how the industry is starting to grow, but I would love to see more information about how many of those systems are actually defense platforms. And that's something I personally have not seen. It doesn't mean that doesn't exist. I just haven't looked at that yet. But I think that that's going to be the next big thing to sort of keep an eye out for as we see countries like Poland wanting to work with Taiwan. And not just them. Czechia is another place where there's a lot of interest. I'm sure you were at the Taipei Security Expo back in September, and all the news that kind of came back related to Poland having its own booth, but also some Ukrainian companies being there, and then countries like Germany having a booth as well. So there's an interest from that region, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, as well as indirectly for Ukraine.
Well, there's also cooperation with the United States, with some private companies involved, like Kratos Defense, for example. So the aim of all of that is to create a non-China supply chain, something that President Lai Ching-te was talking about. Is it really possible to cut China out completely from the drone supply chain?
It is, and there was a report that came out very recently, I think it was the New York Times, like a day ago, which also mentions that Ukraine has started to use non-China component drawn drones, which is a really interesting development. And there's a lot of lessons that ironically the Ukrainians could have towards Taiwan in that regard, if there's an opportunity to be able to sort of transmit those. I do think it's possible, but kind of as we alluded to earlier, the problem is the sort of price point, right? Mm. And in order to get to that point, that's going to require bringing civilian and military sort of sector together, but also the government needing to think of ways to protect that industry, right? Not only from subsidies, but also if you happen to have a drone company, how do you protect family members of those drone producers?
Right.
Right? Like if anybody ends up going to China or trying to blacklist family members for being involved in Taiwan's defense tech industry. There's a whole Pandora's box of things that really opens up. And I do think Taiwan is uniquely positioned to do this. Taiwan's done it with chips before, although very different context. But Taiwan can make itself into the drone arsenal for democracy, and in some ways is already doing that. And working with places like Poland kind of shows that.
Well, speaking of working with places like Poland, in your articles you highlight the need for Taiwan to learn lessons from middle powers,
yes,
rather than emulating juggernauts like the United States or even China. What can Taiwan learn from countries like, let's say, Canada or Poland?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece about that specifically related to Canada a couple months ago, and I think there's a ton to learn. And that was just one sort of example, right? So the different platforms I mentioned, or rather initiatives I mentioned from the Canadian Department of National Defense include one program called IDEA, which looks into innovation in like several different areas, I believe 5, and another one called Mines. And the purpose of IDEA is to sort of do like a catch-all for defense innovation, right? So if you're looking kind of like what Defense Innovation Unit in the United States does, where you want to find a solution to one problem, so you look at a drone or a counter drone system or something like that. Ideas, which is the name of that initiative, is supposed to handle that. But it also can look at other sort of things too. And similarly, Mines is supposed to be a way to sort of seed intellectual capital as well. In addition to those two programs, there's another program that was announced by the Canadian government recently as well, which I unfortunately did not have the opportunity to include in my piece, called Borealis, which looks at using broader sort of innovation across the Canadian government and Canadian industry that have more like explicit dual use capabilities, if you will. So something that might be coming from another government ministry that all of a sudden you can use to help out the Department of National Defense or the Canadian Coast Guard or something along those lines. I think those are some of the lessons that Taiwan can learn. Obviously, Ukraine has a ton of lessons related to their own sort of defense innovation, but places like Norway, for example, are very good at defense innovation. Sweden, despite being very small, is very good at defense innovation as well through state companies like Saab, not just the cars, but also they produce Gripen jets and other sort of things. So I do think Taiwan has this opportunity to really learn from countries that are smaller and are a little bit more nimble to try to be able to sort of reinvent itself internally as well. And I think that that's the importance of doing that. No, reason not to learn from the United States. I mean, I'm a former U.S. government official, worked as a Senate National Security Advisor, love my country. Though I do sort of question if everything that the United States has to offer in terms of defense innovation lessons for Taiwan is always relevant, only because Taiwan's such a unique place, right? Having an economy that is over 90% small and medium enterprises versus having like large defense primes that want to get involved in like defense tech and whatnot makes it a very, very different sort of ecosystem. If Taiwan's going to build up its own economic growth from drones, that means supporting those small and medium enterprises as well.
Well, let's talk about money. President Lai Ching-te is having trouble pushing through his special defense budget, at least at time of recording. That budget is about 40 billion US dollars. There are counter proposals that are significantly lower by about a quarter of that. But even if that budget passes the $40 billion, does that seem like an amount that is high enough to satisfy the needs of Taiwan's defense tech and just the defensive needs of the country, especially if we consider that TSMC alone is planning to spend hundreds of billions of dollars this year alone on expansion. 40 doesn't seem like a whole lot, to be honest.
I think it's a good step in the right direction, and it's important to remember that it's sequenced over several years. So it's not just one sort of like one and done sort of thing. And it's also a supplemental to the annual defense budget. And then, there may or may not in the future be other sort of like one-off arms sales from the United States to Taiwan. And, given some of the geopolitical developments that you're getting in recently, there is a possibility in which other countries might actually try to sell and successfully sell arms to Taiwan in addition to the United States. But I do think that what you're seeing now is interesting. And the government has also been signaling the desire to want to emphasize on procuring domestic procured drones. And if you look at some of the relationships that Taiwan has with, some drone companies that are coming in from the outside, there really is an emphasis put on co-production domestically. And I think that that's going to be a really big key in terms of trying to expand the industry here as well for defense tech and also drones.
Well, I mean, with so much money going into defense, it seems almost like a lost opportunity for the domestic industry to not participate in that and not benefit from that. We spoke about innovation in very vague general terms, but before we go, are there any specific technologies that are being incorporated into aerial drones and then surface systems or submarine systems that are particularly interesting to you?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are really interesting to sort of keep an eye out for as defense sort of tech continues to kind of grow. And actually, the bigger thing is to keep an eye out for software.
Okay.
So you kind of saw this with Operation Spiderweb that Ukraine carried out against, Russian strategic bombers deep into the heart of Russia. And once again, this gets into autonomous weapons, which is a deeply controversial thing. And I should preface as I'm a big fan of always having a human in the loop. I want to put that out there for my own personal sake. But what was really interesting about those was to see how the software systems are changing, where they're able to sort of like identify targets on their own. And I think that that's something to keep an eye out for counter UAS, but also, what sort of terrifying things could come about from that. The other aspect of that too is to remember that you don't actually need higher end chips for a drone to be effective. That's why software is so interesting. And the Ukrainians have been very open, publishing on GitHub, for example, the different sort of like open architecture that they have related to these things. It's a little terrifying because it's out there in the public, but it also makes sure that you're not creating systems where they're just kind of off on their own. You don't really have a full understanding or grasp of what they're doing. So I think not because I find that to be intriguing on their own, per se, but I think that that's a technology to keep an eye out for. And what does that mean for Taiwan or other parts of the Indo-Pacific that are looking to defend themselves?
Well, it's certainly an interesting time to be observing all of that and these developments, and a very important issue for Taiwan. Thank you for coming in. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Bryce Barros, thank you again for joining us on Connected Sidelines.
Thank you, Tomasz. I appreciate it.
How do you think the defense technology will evolve in the next few years? Are drones the future or just hype? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're down there, do check out our main show, Connected on Taiwan Plus. You can find us on our YouTube channel and the Taiwan Plus website. I'm Tomasz Koper. Until next time.